The sun hovered low in the sky, casting its golden hue over the savannah. It was a late afternoon in the village of Nairi, a small settlement nestled on the edge of the vast African plains. The village, surrounded by dense groves of baobab and acacia trees, appeared like a well-kept secret amidst the wild beauty of the land. Here, the rhythms of life were dictated by the sun, the rains, and the cycles of nature. In this world of endless earth and sky, there lived a young man named Zola. He was a hunter, tall and lean, with a body honed by years of training and the trials of the hunt. His skin was the color of rich, dark earth, and his hair, tightly curled, framed a face marked by both wisdom and youth. Zola had grown up with the stories of the elders, tales of ancestors who spoke with the spirits of the land, legends of powerful artifacts hidden in secret places, and above all, the golden mask, a mystical relic that was said to hold the fate of the world in its delicate, gilded hands. Yet Zola had never truly believed in these stories. He had always been more grounded, more concerned with the practicalities of survival, finding food for the village, hunting game, and learning the ways of the wild. His parents, both skilled hunters, had perished when he was still young, leaving him in the care of grandmother Mosi, the village elder. It was she who had instilled in him the value of tradition, of understanding the deeper forces that shaped their lives. Zola sat quietly at the edge of the village, looking out at the undulating grasses of the savannah. His sharp eyes scanned the horizon for signs of game, but his mind wandered elsewhere. The village was peaceful, its people content, but there was an unspoken anxiety that lingered in the air. A strange illness had begun to spread through the village, a sickness that no one could explain. It wasn't like any disease they had encountered before. People fell ill without warning, their strength sapped by an unknown force. The elders had been puzzled, and no remedy could cure it. Zola had never seen the village so unsettled. He had a deep, knowing feeling that something was wrong, something beyond the illness. That feeling tugged at him, pulling him away from his duties as a hunter, and deep into the mysteries of the past. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie. He turned to see grandmother Mosi approaching, her gait slow but deliberate. Her old, gnarled hands grasped a walking stick adorned with carvings of animals and ancestors. Mosi had raised Zola since he was a child, imparting to him the sacred knowledge of their people. Despite her age, there was a sharpness in her eyes that could pierce the very soul. "Child, you are restless," she said, her voice a soft rasp, like wind through dry grass. "The spirits speak to you, don't they?" Zola nodded, though he did not fully understand the depth of his unease. "Yes, grandmother. The village, it feels wrong. People are ill, but I sense it's more than just sickness. Something is coming, I can feel it." Mosi sat down beside him, her wise eyes gazing out over the plains. "You are not wrong, Zola. The winds are shifting. The balance is disturbed." She paused, looking at him with a knowing expression. "You are ready for something more than hunting now. The ancestors have chosen you." Zola's heart raced at the words. He had heard the elders speak of chosen ones, of individuals whose fates were entwined with the destiny of the people. But he had never thought of himself in that way. He was just a hunter, after all. "I don't understand, grandmother," he said, his voice low with doubt. Mosi's lips parted in a slow smile. "The golden mask," she said. "You know of it, don't you?" Zola's brow furrowed, and he nodded. The golden mask was a legend passed down through the generations. It was said to be a powerful artifact, crafted by the gods themselves, a mask that could reveal the truth of the world to the one who was worthy. But it had been lost for centuries, hidden away by the ancestors, its power sealed until the right time came. "I've heard the stories," Zola replied. "But I don't believe in them. The mask is just a myth." Mosi's gaze softened. "It is no myth, my child. The mask exists, and its time has come again. The spirits have spoken. The balance of the land is threatened by forces older than the village itself. The plague, the sickness, it is the work of dark forces, forces that seek to claim what was never theirs. Only one who is truly worthy can restore the balance. Zola's mind raced, trying to comprehend her words. But why me? I am no great leader, no king. I am just a hunter. Mosi's eyes twinkled with quiet wisdom. Sometimes, the greatest leaders are those who do not seek power, but who are called to it in their time of need. You have the heart of a protector, Zola. It is your spirit that the ancestors have chosen. But the journey will not be easy. The mask will test you, and those who accompany you. You must prove your worth. Zola felt a heavy weight settle on his chest. This was a burden he had not sought, but it was one he could not ignore. The village needed him, whether he was ready or not. Grandmother Mosi reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out a small, weathered piece of parchment. It was old, its edges frayed with age, and it seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. "This is a map," she said, handing it to him. "It will lead you to the mask. But be warned, many have tried to find it before you. None have succeeded." Zola unfurled the map. It was covered in strange symbols and intricate markings, the likes of which he had never seen. At the center of the map was a large, circular symbol, an image of a mask, surrounded by patterns that looked like ancient writing. Zola's eyes traced the path that wound through the dense jungles and treacherous mountains, leading to a place marked with a symbol of darkness. "This is the path?" Zola asked, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. Mosi nodded. "It is the only path. Follow it, and you will find what you seek. But remember, Zola, the golden mask reveals its secrets only to those who are worthy. You must be prepared to face not only the dangers of the journey but the darkness within yourself." Zola's hand clenched around the map. The village's future, and perhaps his own, depended on him finding the golden mask. He had no choice but to go. "I will go," he said, his voice firm. "I will find the mask." Mosi smiled softly. "I knew you would. But you cannot do it alone." Zola looked up, confused. "Who will come with me?" At that moment, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, Tendai, a tall, lithe archer with a quick wit and a sharp eye. His skin was the color of dark honey, and his features were finely sculpted, though often marked by a playful expression. Tendai was Zola's closest friend, a companion through many hunts, a brother of sorts. "I will go with you," Tendai said, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken loyalty. "I've got your back, Zola. We've faced the world together before. We can face whatever comes." Zola looked at him, grateful but wary. "This is no simple hunt, Tendai. This is something much greater." Tendai grinned. "No hunt worth the journey is ever simple. Besides, you'll need someone with a sharp eye to keep you from getting lost." Zola smiled, feeling the bond of friendship strengthen within him. He knew that Tendai would be a valuable ally on this journey, but there would be others who would need to join them. The mask was no ordinary treasure, and it would take more than just strength to find it. Together, they would begin their journey, following the path that the ancestors had set before them. The village of Nairi had no idea what was coming, but Zola knew one thing for certain: the future of his people lay in the balance, and it was up to him to restore it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Zola and Tendai set out, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. The adventure had begun, and the prophecy of the golden mask was about to unfold. The morning after Zola's conversation with Grandmother Mosi, the sky was a brilliant shade of orange as the first light of dawn stretched over the savannah. A cool breeze rustled the tall grasses, and the air was heavy with the scent of the earth, dampened by the morning dew. The village of Nairi was still and quiet, the people going about their early routines. Zola stood by the edge of the village, his hand resting on his hunting spear. Beside him stood Tendai, who was adjusting the bow slung across his back, his quiver of arrows positioned carefully for easy access. The two friends stood in silence, knowing the gravity of the journey they were about to embark on. Behind them, the village stretched out, nestled against the edges of the wild, and before them lay an uncertain path. Tendai turned to Zola, his expression serious but tempered by the ever-present lightness of his nature. "Ready?" he asked. Zola gave him a steady nod. "As ready as I'll ever be." They had no time to waste. The map that Mosi had given Zola was not merely a path through the land, but a symbol of their quest, a reminder that they were not only walking for themselves but for the entire village. Zola had no illusions about the difficulty ahead. There were many dangers in the wild, but more than that, the mask itself was surrounded by ancient magic and dark forces that had stood the test of time. The journey would test them both. With that, they set off, leaving the familiar sights of Nairi behind. The landscape around them quickly changed as they moved beyond the boundaries of the village. The dense groves of acacia trees gave way to wide-open plains, where the tall grass swayed in the wind like a sea of green. In the distance, the jagged outlines of the mountains could be seen, their peaks hidden in a shroud of mist. The path was treacherous, winding its way through the wilderness in a series of twists and turns. It was not a direct road, but rather a series of hidden trails known only to the ancestors. Zola and Tendai moved with caution, knowing that the wild was as unpredictable as it was beautiful. They had encountered predators before, but the threat they were walking into was much more dangerous. Dark forces stirred beyond the horizon, and the land seemed to hum with an energy that Zola could not quite understand. They spent the first few days crossing the savannah, navigating through dense brush, and climbing the rocky outcrops that dotted the landscape. Each night, they camped by the edge of the river, cooking their small catches over the fire, their shadows flickering against the still waters. Zola's thoughts often drifted back to his village, to the sick people, and the weight of responsibility that had suddenly fallen upon him. He did not share these thoughts with Tendai. His friend was full of optimism and good cheer, but Zola felt a burden growing heavier with each passing day. He had not asked to be the one chosen for this task, but he could not turn back. The fate of Nairi, and perhaps something far greater, depended on what he was about to do. As they journeyed deeper into the wilderness, the land grew more rugged. The forest thickened, and the shadows of the trees stretched long, casting an eerie gloom over the path. There were signs of the ancient people who had lived here long ago, the remains of old stone structures, weathered and crumbled by time, hidden away under thick layers of moss and vine. Zola often wondered who these people were and what their connection to the mask had been. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the mask was not just an artifact, it was a key, a puzzle piece that had been waiting for the right moment to be revealed. On the 5th day of their journey, they reached the foot of the mountains of Umara, a range of jagged peaks that loomed like silent sentinels guarding the land. The mountains were ancient, older than the village itself, and local legend held that they were once the domain of powerful spirits. The air was thinner here, and the wind carried with it the scent of pine and cold stone. The terrain was steep, and the ascent was arduous. Zola's muscles burned with exertion, but he did not falter. Tendai, ever the optimist, looked at the towering peaks with a grin. "This should be interesting," he said, eyes glinting with excitement. "You never change," Zola replied with a smile, though his words were tinged with weariness. He had been leading them through the mountains for hours, and the path was becoming more difficult to follow. The trail grew less defined, the ground beneath them rocky and unstable. By the time nightfall descended, the two friends had found a small cave in which to shelter. The wind howled outside, rattling the rocks and causing the trees to creak and groan. They built a small fire, its warm light flickering against the dark stone walls. As they sat down to rest, Zola unfolded the map once more, studying the intricate markings. "The mask should be somewhere near the heart of the mountains," Zola muttered, tracing the path on the map. "We are close, I can feel it." Tendai looked up from the fire, his brow furrowed. You've been saying that for days now. Are you sure we are on the right path? Zola nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. We are. We have to be. As they spoke, a low rumble echoed through the cave, the sound of distant thunder reverberating through the stone. Zola stiffened, his senses on alert. The air had grown colder, and a strange energy filled the cave. It was as if the land itself was alive, watching them. What was that? Tendai asked, his voice laced with unease. Zola stood, his hand instinctively resting on his spear. Stay close. Another rumble followed, this time much louder, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Zola's heart raced as a figure appeared at the entrance of the cave, emerging from the darkness. It was not human. The creature was tall, cloaked in shadows, its form indistinct and shifting like smoke. It had glowing eyes that burned with an unnatural light, and its presence filled the cave with an oppressive weight. Zola's grip on his spear tightened as he stepped forward, preparing to defend himself. The creature spoke in a low, gravelly voice, its words echoing through the cave. You seek the golden mask, but do you know what you face? Zola stood frozen, his mind racing. This was no mere animal or simple obstacle. This was something far older, far more dangerous. What are you? Zola demanded, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at his chest. The creature's glowing eyes turned toward him, and it grinned, its teeth sharp and jagged. I am the guardian of the mask, and you are not the first to seek it. But you may be the last. Before Zola could respond, the creature lunged forward, its form shifting like smoke, faster than any beast he had ever encountered. Zola barely had time to react as it collided with him, knocking him to the ground. Tendai sprang into action, drawing his bow and loosing an arrow, but the creature seemed to vanish into the air, reappearing behind him in an instant. The battle was swift, brutal, and unlike anything Zola had faced before. The creature moved with impossible speed, its shadowy form phasing in and out of existence. Zola's spear struck at empty air more times than he could count, and Tendai's arrows were ineffective, passing harmlessly through the creature's ethereal body. But Zola was not one to give up. Drawing upon his years of training and his inner strength, he focused all his energy into one final strike. With a roar, he thrust his spear forward, channeling the force of his ancestors through his body. The spear connected, and for the briefest moment, the creature let out a howl of pain before dissipating into mist. The cave fell silent, the tension easing as the creature vanished completely. Zola collapsed to his knees, panting heavily. Tendai approached cautiously, his bow still in hand. What was that? Tendai asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zola stood, wiping the sweat from his brow. It was a guardian. A protector of the mask. Tendai nodded, his eyes wide with shock. Then the mask is close. Too close. Zola's expression hardened. We have to keep going. We can't stop now. The golden mask was within their grasp, but so too were the dangers that awaited them. They had only just begun to understand the true cost of their quest. And the journey was far from over. The cold, clammy air of the cave pressed in on Zola and Tendai as they ventured deeper, the shadows stretching with them as they moved. The stone walls whispered of forgotten times, their carvings worn and faint, depicting scenes of long-gone heroes and mighty gods. It was as though the mountain itself held secrets, ancient as the stars, waiting for the right soul to awaken them. The light from the torch they carried cast a flickering, uncertain glow, throwing grotesque shapes on the walls, making their already tense footsteps feel like echoes of some other, unseen presence. Tendai, ever the optimist, was quiet now, sensing the weight of the atmosphere around them. Zola, on the other hand, had long since pushed his thoughts aside, focusing solely on the path ahead, his gaze fixed on the deeper passage that led to the cavern where the golden mask was said to reside. They had walked for hours, the air growing colder as they descended, until they reached a cavernous chamber. The floor was vast and uneven, the ceiling arching high above them, seemingly lost in the darkness. The cavern was eerily silent except for the sound of their breathing and the occasional distant drip of water echoing off the walls. But there was something else in the air, an oppressive energy, ancient and powerful, that seemed to pulsate from the very stones. At the center of the room stood a raised stone platform, and upon it rested the golden mask. It was breathtaking, a gleaming artifact that seemed to shine even in the dim light, its polished surface catching every shadow and gleaming with an otherworldly glow. Zola could hardly breathe as he gazed at it, his heart pounding with a mixture of awe and fear. The mask's intricate design was unlike anything he had ever seen, fine lines etched across its surface, curving and spiraling, as if it had been formed by a master of the ancient craft, capable of channeling powers beyond mortal comprehension. Zola had known it was coming, but the reality of it before him was overwhelming. The golden mask was both a blessing and a curse, a symbol of their village's heritage, yet it held power that no one truly understood. He could feel its pull, a magnetic force that called him closer, urging him to touch it, to claim it as his own. His hand reached out, but before his fingers could make contact, a deep voice thundered across the room. "Do not touch it." Zola froze, his fingers mere inches from the mask. The voice was not human, not a voice at all really, but something deeper, more resonant, like the land itself speaking to him. Tendai instinctively stepped back, his hand tightening on his bow, prepared for a threat. But the figure that emerged from the shadows was not one they had prepared for. A tall figure, cloaked in robes of black that seemed to absorb the light around it, moved into the open. Its face was hidden by a hood, but the glow of its eyes pierced the darkness like twin suns, pale, luminous, and full of ancient power. As it approached, the mask seemed to hum, its surface rippling as if responding to the figure's presence. The figure did not speak immediately. It moved like a shadow, flowing silently across the room until it stopped just before the pedestal holding the mask. Its form was tall and lean, its movements fluid, almost as if it was one with the cave itself. "I am Zerethu, the guardian of the mask," the figure spoke, its voice deep, resonant, like the growl of thunder. "You are not the first to come seeking it, but you may be the last to stand before me." Zola took a cautious step forward, his hand tightening around the handle of his spear. "We seek the mask," he said, his voice steady despite the unease that churned within him. "The village is in danger. We need its power." Zerethu tilted its head slightly, the hood falling back to reveal an ethereal face, pale, gaunt, with skin that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unearthly light, and its expression was one of dispassionate judgment. "The mask is not power to be wielded," Zerethu said, its voice quiet, almost as though it was speaking to itself. "It is a force of balance. Only those who have proven themselves worthy may lay claim to it. Only those who can pass the trials." Zola's heart quickened, and his gaze flickered to Tendai, who looked as perplexed as he felt. "Trials? What trials? We've already fought through dangers to get here." Zerethu's laugh was a low, hollow sound that reverberated through the cavern. "You have faced the Guardian, but that was but a glimpse of what lies ahead. The mask reveals not only your strength, but your soul. You will face the trial of the heart, the trial of the mind, and the trial of the spirit." Zola's brow furrowed. "What do you mean by that?" "The trial of the heart will test your courage and your ability to face your deepest fears. The trial of the mind will challenge your intellect and your wisdom. And the trial of the spirit will push you to your very limits, testing your resolve and your connection to the land, to your ancestors." Zola felt a chill run down his spine. The mask, it seemed, was not just a physical object but a manifestation of something far older, something bound to the very fabric of existence in this land. The path ahead was not merely about retrieving an artifact, it was about proving their worthiness in ways they could not yet fathom. "You cannot proceed unless you accept the trials," Zerethu intoned, its voice a low rumble that filled the cavern. And know this: failure is not an option. Should you falter, the mask will claim your soul. Zola's mind raced, but he knew there was no turning back. Tendai, sensing his resolve, stepped forward as well, though his expression was strained. "We are ready," Zola said, his voice firm despite the fear that had begun to settle in his chest. Zerathu nodded slowly, and with a wave of its hand, the air in the cavern shifted. The room around them seemed to melt away, and in its place, a thick fog materialized. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, and the very atmosphere pulsed with an energy that Zola had never felt before. He looked around, but the cavern had vanished, replaced by a dense, eerie forest. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, and the air was thick with a strange, oppressive silence. "This is the trial of the heart," Zerathu's voice echoed through the fog. "You will each face your greatest fear here. Only by confronting it can you proceed." Before Zola could respond, the ground beneath his feet trembled, and a figure stepped out from the mist, a figure that sent a jolt of terror through his heart. It was Olu, his older brother. Zola's stomach dropped. Olu had been lost to the wilderness years ago, never to return. His body had never been found, and the villagers had whispered of the wild beasts that had taken him. Yet here he stood, alive, unharmed, staring at Zola with dark eyes that mirrored his own. "Zola," Olu's voice was soft, almost like a whisper in the wind. "Why did you leave me?" Zola stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. His legs were weak beneath him, and his mind was filled with 1,000 conflicting emotions. Olu was dead. This was not real. "No, this isn't you," Zola whispered, trying to steady himself. "You're dead. You're not real." But Olu's image only stepped closer, the same dark eyes filled with accusation. "You abandoned me. You didn't come for me. I died because you couldn't save me. Do you remember?" Zola's breath came in shallow gusts, and his heart hammered in his chest. His brother's death had haunted him for years, a wound that had never healed. Now, in this surreal place, the pain was real again, sharper than ever. Tendai, too, had his own trial to face. He turned and saw his village burning. The huts, the people, his family, all consumed by flames. His arrows were useless, his bow splintered in his hand. He could do nothing. His hands shook, and his body trembled as he fell to his knees. The trial of the heart was not simply a test of fear, it was a confrontation with their deepest regrets, their unresolved grief. It was a trial of pain and loss. Zola clenched his fists. He would not give in. He would not succumb to this illusion. He had to press forward, for the village, for his people. "I didn't abandon you, Olu," Zola shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "I fought for you. I did everything I could." The figure of Olu faded, dissolving into mist. Zola stood trembling, but he knew he had passed the first trial. He had faced his fear and conquered it. Tendai, too, stood up, shaking the remnants of his nightmare from his mind. The trial of the heart was only the beginning. What lay ahead would demand more than they had ever imagined. The fog that had surrounded Zola and Tendai lifted like a curtain drawn by unseen hands, revealing a stark and unfamiliar landscape. The eerie forest had dissolved, replaced by a vast, open plain stretching for miles. The horizon was hazy, the sun casting a muted light over the earth, giving everything a dreamlike quality. There was a stillness in the air, an unnatural silence that pressed against them from all sides. Zola took a cautious step forward, his senses heightened, scanning the unfamiliar environment for any signs of danger. The trial of the heart had tested them deeply, forcing them to face their fears and unresolved grief. Now they were in the midst of the trial of the mind, but what form would it take? What would the mask require of them in this trial? Tendai looked around, his sharp eyes scanning the desolate landscape. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice quiet but laced with confusion. "This place, it feels wrong." Zola didn't respond immediately. Instead, he focused on the horizon, feeling the weight of the air around them. He felt something stirring beneath the surface of the ground, an energy that pulsed just out of reach. It was almost as if the land itself was alive, observing them, waiting. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the distant horizon, a dark silhouette against the light, moving with purpose. The figure grew closer with each passing second, and as it neared, Zola's heart skipped a beat. He knew this person. It was Tani, his childhood friend, but not the Tani he had known. This Tani was different, darker, more menacing. His once bright eyes were now filled with a cold, calculating glint, and his expression was one of smug superiority. The Tani before him now was a stranger, a distorted version of the friend Zola had once trusted implicitly. "Tani!" Zola called out, his voice filled with disbelief. "What is this? Why are you here?" Tani's lips curled into a cruel smile, but his eyes betrayed no warmth. "You've always been the one to protect others, Zola," he said, his voice cold and mocking. "But what about yourself? What have you done for your own sake? For your own survival?" Zola shook his head, confused. This was not the Tani he knew. "What do you mean? You're not real. You can't be." But Tani simply chuckled, the sound reverberating in the still air. "Isn't it amusing?" he said. "You think you're a hero, always looking out for others, always putting yourself last. But what do you have to show for it? A life of constant sacrifice, of never taking for yourself." Zola felt a pang of unease. The words struck deep, and for a moment, he was caught off guard. Hadn't he always put others first? His village, his family, even strangers, he had fought for them all. But what had it cost him? His brother was gone, his family always in danger, and here he was wandering through trials with nothing but his own pain to keep him company. Tendai, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His brows furrowed, and his hand instinctively went to the hilt of his dagger. "You're lying. This isn't Tani. This is an illusion, a trick of the mask." Zola turned to his companion, struggling to shake off the creeping self-doubt that Tani's words had planted. "I know," he muttered, his voice thick. "But it's hard to ignore. It's like it knows exactly what to say." Tani, if it could still be called Tani, took another step forward, his eyes glinting with an almost cruel satisfaction. "You see, Zola," he said, his tone now soft but piercing, "you are your own enemy. The mask doesn't need to fight you. It needs only to reveal the truth to you. And the truth is, you are weak. You always have been." The ground beneath them trembled as the vision of Tani began to swirl, becoming nothing but a cloud of smoke that seemed to burn into Zola's mind. But in the haze, a thought lingered, a whisper that made his pulse race. "Am I weak?" The trial of the mind, Zola realized, was not a trial of physical strength but of internal fortitude. It was about confronting the darkest corners of his own mind, the doubts and fears that had always lingered, whispering in the shadows. He had thought he was strong, that his will was unbreakable. But here, in this moment, those lies were being shattered, revealing the fragility beneath. He couldn't allow himself to falter. He couldn't let these illusions consume him. His village, his people, they depended on him. The mask, he now understood, was showing him these visions not to destroy him, but to challenge his very core, to see if he could overcome them. Tendai stepped in front of him, blocking the last remnants of the vision. "Zola," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're not alone in this. We are in this together. Remember who you are. Remember why you came here." Zola's chest tightened as the fog began to lift once more. Tendai's words were like a beacon in the darkness, pulling him back from the brink. He looked at his companion, his friend who had fought by his side from the beginning, and he knew then that he wasn't weak. No matter what this trial threw at him, he would not falter. He would rise to face it. He nodded at Tendai. "You're right. I can't let this consume me." And with that, the vision of Tani vanished, dissipating into nothingness. The ground beneath them settled, and the plain stretched out once more. Zola took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he released the tension that had built within him. The trial of the mind had tested him, but it had also strengthened him, revealing the depth of his resolve. However, just as Zola thought the trial was over, a voice echoed through the air, cutting through the stillness. "Not yet." Zola spun around, heart racing. From the center of the plain, the air shimmered, and in its place stood an immense, towering figure, an apparition that dwarfed everything around them. Its form was vast, swirling with energy and light, its eyes like deep pools of infinite blackness. It was a creature born from pure thought, a manifestation of the mask's power to shape and twist reality itself. The figure's voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath them. "You have passed the first test, Zola, but the mind is not only made of doubts. It is made of knowledge, of wisdom. To pass this trial, you must face not only your fears but your ignorance." Zola's mind raced as the figure's words sank in. This was not over. The trial of the mind was not just about internal conflict, it was about knowledge. The mask sought to reveal whether they were worthy of its secrets by testing their wisdom. But how? What was it that the mask wanted from him? The figure raised its hand, and from the ether, an object materialized, a heavy, ancient book bound in gold, its pages shimmering with an ethereal light. The figure extended the book toward Zola, its shadow stretching across the plain. "This book holds the knowledge of the ancestors," the figure intoned. "You must answer its riddle correctly to pass this trial. Fail, and you will remain trapped in this illusion, forever bound to your own mind." Zola reached out, taking the book in his hands. Its weight was immense, as though it carried the wisdom of generations past. He opened it carefully, feeling the power radiating from the pages. The book seemed to hum in his grasp, its words appearing and disappearing as he flipped through the ancient text, as if testing his very ability to comprehend the vast knowledge within. And then, the riddle appeared. "I am the beginning of the end and the end of time. I am the beginning of eternity, yet I have no form. What am I?" Zola stared at the riddle, his mind racing. This was no ordinary puzzle. The answer was not to be found in logic alone. It was something deeper, something tied to the essence of the world they inhabited, something that existed beyond the limits of human understanding. He closed his eyes, focusing on the words, the energy around him, letting his mind clear. The riddle was not just about the answer, it was about understanding the flow of life itself, the cycle that bound everything together. Time, the eternity, the beginning, and the end, what was the common thread that bound them? And then, the answer came to him, as if whispered by the ancestors themselves. The letter E. He spoke the answer aloud, and as the words left his lips, the immense figure before him nodded once, its form dissolving into the air. The ground beneath them shifted again, and a burst of light exploded from the book in his hands, enveloping them in a blinding glow. Zola felt a surge of energy course through him, and in that moment he knew they had passed the trial of the mind. It had tested his intellect, his wisdom, and his ability to understand the deeper forces at work in the world. But it had also tested his will, and he had succeeded. As the light faded, the plane shifted again, revealing the next stage of their journey, the final trial, the trial of the spirit. The world around Zola and Tendai shifted once again. The vast, endless plain that had surrounded them moments ago faded into an expanse of shimmering gold, an infinite sea of light. It wasn't a typical light, though, but something deeper, a sacred luminescence, like the first dawn that breaks over a new world. The air felt different now, heavy with a sense of profound purpose. Zola's breath caught in his throat. The trial of the mind had been challenging enough, forcing him to confront his darkest thoughts and deepest fears. But now, as he gazed at the unfolding landscape, a quiet dread stirred within him. This felt like the final test. The trial of the spirit was something far more elusive than the others, something that could not be solved by knowledge or strength alone. It demanded something else, something intrinsic to the very core of his being. Tendai, who had been walking silently by his side, stopped and raised his head. His eyes glinted with the same sharpness they always held, but there was something different in the air now. He, too, sensed the weight of what was to come. "What is this place?" Tendai asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Zola looked around, his mind racing for answers. "I don't know, but I feel like we're being tested in a way we haven't been before. It's not just about our abilities or our knowledge. This is deeper." Tendai nodded, his face grim. The trial of the spirit was said to reveal the innermost truth about a person, their deepest desires, their greatest fears, and their ultimate strengths. It was a test not of what one could achieve, but of who they were at the very essence of their being. As they walked further into the golden expanse, the light around them began to shift, forming images in the air. At first, they were vague, indistinct shapes, like shadows flickering at the edges of a fire. But then, with each step they took, the images solidified. Zola saw the form of a woman, his mother, standing before him, her face warm with love and pride. Her hands, rough from years of toil, held a child, a younger version of Zola. He could hear the faint murmur of her voice calling him by name, a sound that filled his heart with an overwhelming sense of nostalgia and love. He reached out instinctively, but as his hand approached her, the vision shifted. The light around him grew dimmer, and the image of his mother twisted, transforming into something darker. Her face, once filled with warmth, now contorted into a mask of anger and betrayal. The child she held vanished, replaced by a figure that Zola didn't recognize at first, but then it hit him, a shadow of himself, someone filled with regret and lost potential. The child was no longer a symbol of hope but of failure. "No," Zola whispered, stepping back. "This isn't real. It can't be." But the vision continued to play out, as if mocking him. The child, the version of him that had never grown into the man he was destined to be, was now staring back at him, its eyes hollow and full of disappointment. His mother's voice rang out, but now it was laced with sorrow, filled with accusations. "You could have been so much more, Zola. You could have been the protector you always claimed to be, but you failed. You failed us all." Zola's heart tightened in his chest. He stumbled backward, shaking his head, trying to dispel the image. But no matter how hard he tried to tear his gaze away, it stayed, like a nightmare that wouldn't let go. The golden expanse around him seemed to collapse, pulling him into a vortex of regret. Tendai stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Zola, this is the trial. This is the spirit testing you. You must confront your greatest fears." Zola turned to face his friend, his face pale and drawn. "I'm not afraid of this. I'm afraid of failing again. I'm afraid that everything I've done, everything I've worked for, will be for nothing." Tendai's eyes softened. "You've already done more than most could ever dream of. You have faced your fears. Now, face your truth. Only then can you pass the trial of the spirit." The words rang in Zola's ears, cutting through the illusion. He took a deep breath, clenching his fists at his sides. The vision of his mother's twisted face flickered and began to fade, the dark energy dissipating like mist in the morning sun. But it wasn't enough. The true test had yet to come. As the vision of his mother faded, another image materialized before him, a man he recognized immediately. His father. But this was not the same man Zola had known. His father, too, had changed in the golden light. He was no longer the strong, stoic leader of their village. Now, he was broken, defeated by time, his hands shaking as he held a blade that had once been a symbol of their family's strength. The blade was now dull, useless. Zola could see the man's eyes, haunted, tired, defeated. "Father," Zola whispered. "What happened to you?" The man's eyes met Zola's, and for a brief moment, Zola felt the weight of his father's pain. "You don't understand," his father said, his voice cracked with sorrow. "I failed you, son. I failed this entire village. And now, you will carry the weight of my mistakes. You will carry the weight of this world." The words stung deep, each one cutting into Zola's heart like a blade. He had always believed that he had to be the one to protect everyone, that he had to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. But now it seemed that he was doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. "No," Zola shouted, his voice trembling. "I will not be you. I will not fail." Tendai stepped forward again, his voice calm but unwavering. "Zola, this is not your father. This is the manifestation of your fears, your doubts. You are not bound by the past. You are your own person." The ground trembled beneath them as the vision of Zola's father shattered into 1,000 pieces. The light around them grew brighter, and the vortex of doubt that had once threatened to consume Zola began to recede. The pain, the regret, and the fear that had haunted him were finally beginning to fade. The golden expanse shifted, and the vision of his father was replaced by something else. Zola was standing alone in the midst of a vast field of tall, golden grass, the wind whipping around him. He felt a strange sense of clarity, as if something deep within him was awakening. Tendai stood beside him, his expression calm, his eyes unwavering. "You've passed the trial of the spirit," Tendai said softly. Zola closed his eyes, feeling the rush of emotions flood through him, relief, triumph, and an overwhelming sense of release. The trial had been the most difficult, the most personal. It had forced him to confront everything he had buried deep within himself, his fears, his regrets, and his self-doubt. But in the end, he had faced it all. He had come to terms with who he was, not as the son of his father or the protector of his village, but as Zola, his own man, with his own path to walk. The golden light around them began to fade, and the world returned to normal. The expansive field was gone, replaced by the familiar landscape of the jungle, the sounds of nature filling the air once more. The mask of the ancestors had spoken its final words, and the trial was over. Zola turned to Tendai, a sense of gratitude welling up in his chest. "Thank you for everything." Tendai smiled, his eyes full of quiet pride. "You did it, Zola. You faced yourself, and you overcame it. The mask has nothing more to show you. The final test is over. Now, you can return." But Zola knew that this journey was only just beginning. The trials had revealed the depth of his spirit, his strength, and his resolve. He was no longer the boy who feared the future or the man who carried the weight of his father's mistakes. He was Zola, the one destined to lead. And with Tendai by his side, Zola was ready for whatever lay ahead.